I still remember the way the chandeliers glowed above me, their golden light spilling across the white linen tables. The room was alive with music and laughter, the clinking of glasses, the shimmer of gowns. It was the kind of ballroom where everything seemed to sparkle, everything except me. I felt like a misplaced piece in someone else's perfect picture. I wore a simple navy dress, one I had owned for years. It was pressed neatly, but next to the sequins and silk of the other guests, I stood out in all the wrong ways. As I walked in, I could feel the eyes on me, hear the whispers just behind my back. That's the groom's mother. She looks so plain, so poor. Their words were quiet but sharp enough to cut. An usher led me not to the front, not to the family table where Daniel and his new bride sat surrounded by Madison's relatives, but to table 15 tucked far away near the back. I sat among distant cousins. I barely knew people who avoided meeting my eyes, filling the silence with polite small talk that felt more like pity. From where I sat, I could see Daniel raise his glass at the head table, Madison laughing beside him, her arm looped possessively through his. They looked radiant. They looked like strangers to me. As I lifted my water glass, I caught Daniel's profile, and for a fleeting second remembered the little boy who used to fall asleep waiting for me to come home from late shifts. He had those same eyes, the ones that once searched for me through the cracked window of our apartment, desperate for a mother who was always running, always tired. But tonight his gaze never found mine. He was absorbed in her. I was lost in that memory when I heard the deliberate click of heels against marble. Madison was walking straight toward me, her white gown trailing behind her, her lips pulled into a smile that looked sweet from a distance but sharp up close. She stopped at my chair, leaning down so the surrounding tables could hear every word. "Daniel's told me so much about his childhood," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. "He said you were never there, always working, always too busy." My cheeks burned as I forced a polite smile. I worked to keep a roof over his head. I did what I had to do after his father. "Oh, I know," she cut me off, her smile widening. "You chose work over your son, missed his games, his school plays, and now you expect to play grandmother, to play family conversations around us faded." I felt the silence pressing in the weight of dozens of eyes on me. Phones lifted, recording, ready for spectacle. "Madison." "This isn't the time," I whispered. My voice shook, though I willed it not to. Her hand pressed firmly against my shoulder, pinning me to the chair. In her other hand, she lifted the plate of mashed potatoes that had been set down just minutes earlier. I barely had a chance to flinch. "Why don't you taste what a real family dinner feels like?" she hissed. And with one quick motion, she slammed the plate against my face. The heat burned instantly, searing my skin. The potatoes slid down my cheek into my hair, down the neckline of my dress. The weight of it knocked me sideways, the sting mixing with the sharp tang of humiliation. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, all I could hear was my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then the room erupted. Gasps, chairs, scraping back voices overlapping. Someone laughed nervously. Another cried out in shock. The glow of camera flashes flickered as guests tried to capture what they thought was a scene worth sharing. I sat frozen potatoes dripping from my chin, my hands trembling on the edge of the table. And then one voice rose above the chaos. A man near the bar, his face pale with recognition, shouted so everyone could hear, "Oh my God! Do you people have any idea who you just humiliated?" "That's Evelyn Harper. Yeah. She's worth over $3 billion. The ballroom went silent. Utterly silent. I slowly stood, the food still sliding from my face, the weight of $3 billion hanging in the air like a stone. Madison's hand went limp at her side, the color draining from her cheeks. Daniel stood at the head table, his mouth open, eyes darting between me and the stranger who had just revealed the secret I had guarded for decades. The hush was suffocating. Every gaze was fixed on me. The simple navy dress I had chosen suddenly transformed into a costume for a woman no one thought they knew. My dignity had been shattered, but in that moment I refused to let them see me break. I picked up a napkin, wiped what I could from my face, and placed it neatly back on the table. Without a word, I straightened my back, turned, and walked toward the exit. The sound of my heels echoed through the silence. No one stopped me. No one dared to speak. Behind me, I could feel their eyes following, heavy with shock and calculation, but I didn't turn around. Not once. I pushed open the grand doors of the ballroom and stepped into the cool night air, leaving the noise, the whispers, and the wreckage of my son's wedding behind me. The navy dress slid from my shoulders onto the floor, a crumpled reminder of what had happened hours earlier. I stood in front of the mirror in my Boston apartment, staring at the woman looking back. My hair was stiff with dried potatoes, my skin blotched red where the heat had burned me. My reflection wasn't just a face covered in food, it was the image of a mother humiliated in front of her only child. I turned away and stepped into the shower, twisting the faucet, until scalding water thundered down. I scrubbed and scrubbed, dragging my fingers through my hair, but the smell of butter and garlic clung stubbornly. The heat made my skin sting, but I welcomed the pain. It was cleaner than the shame. I rinsed again, shampooed twice, then again a third time, but still I could smell it faint, as though humiliation had seeped into my pores. When I finally shut off the water, steam curling thick around me, my legs trembled. I wrapped myself in a towel and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pale blue walls. The silence of the apartment pressed in, but inside my chest there was a noise, a storm of anger and humiliation that refused to quiet. I reached for my laptop. The screen glowed in the dark room, and there it was, already waiting for me. A video of Madison slamming that plate into my face had gone viral. Someone had slowed it down, added captions. "Mother of the groom gets what she deserves." Millions of views in less than a day. I clicked on the comments against my better judgment. She probably deserved it. Some moms are greedy. Poor guy marrying into that mess. Each word was a dagger. Strangers, thousands of them, tearing apart a life they knew nothing about. I closed the laptop with a snap and pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes. Anger burned hotter than the potatoes ever had. I had worked too hard, bled too much to be reduced to a meme. On the nightstand was an old photo album. I pulled it into my lap, the leather cover worn soft from years of being touched and tucked away. I opened to a page with a faded picture of Daniel at 6 years old, asleep on our threadbare couch, his cheeks damp from crying himself to sleep while I was at work. He was so small then, so alone. I traced his face with my fingertips, remembering the promise I made to him in the dark, that I would build something that could never be taken from us. That promise had cost me everything. James, my husband, had died suddenly in 1991, leaving me with nothing but debts and menacing strangers knocking at my door. Loan sharks with tattoos creeping up their necks had come looking for payment, hinting that they'd collect in other ways if I didn't find the money. I had worked nights, mornings, weekends, cleaning offices, selling whatever I could, clutching Daniel to me like a shield. All of it had been for him. And now he looked at me like I was the enemy. Madison had poisoned him against me, and I had let her. I picked up the phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in months. Marcus Reed. Former FBI, now my security consultant. He'd been with me for 15 years, the kind of man who could read danger before it stepped through the door. When he answered, his voice was low alert. "Mrs. Harper." "It's Evelyn," I said, steadying my voice. "I need you to run a full background check on my daughter-in-law. Everything. I don't care how deep you have to dig. Do it quickly and quietly." There was no hesitation. "Understood." I hung up, relief washing over me, thin but enough. I stared at the dark window, the city lights blurred beyond it. Madison thought I was a weak old woman she could humiliate and then control. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 3 days passed. I barely left the apartment, waiting for Marcus's report, watching the video spread like wildfire. Reporters gathered outside Daniel's office in New York, not mine. I kept my blinds closed, living in the stillness, nursing a fury that only grew sharper. On the 3rd day, my phone rang. For a moment, my heart lifted when I saw Daniel's name on the screen. Then I remembered the look in his eyes at the wedding. Confused, distant, not the son who once clung to my hand. I answered. His voice was cold flat, nothing like the boy I had raised. "We need to talk," he said without a greeting. 5th Street Cafe. 1 hour. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear, my pulse heavy in my throat. 1 hour. A public place, neutral ground. My son wanted answers, but not here, not in the home I had built. That distance said more than his words ever could. I set the phone down carefully, slid the old photo album back onto the nightstand, and began to dress. The storm inside me had found its target. It was time to face my son. The cafe on 5th Street smelled of roasted beans, and wet wool from coats hung near the door. A light drizzle clung to the windows, tiny drops gathering and rolling down the glass. I slid into a corner booth where I could see the entrance. My heart thumped in my chest, louder than the rain outside. When Daniel walked in, he looked sharper than I remembered. A charcoal gray suit tie, knotted perfectly, shoes polished. He could have been walking into a boardroom, not meeting his mother. His eyes scanned the cafe until they landed on me. No smile, no warmth. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of conversation from other tables filled the silence between us. Then he leaned forward, his voice low but hard as stone. "Is it true? Are you really worth billions?" I drew a steady breath. "Yes." His jaw tightened. "So you let me grow up scraping by thinking we had nothing. You let me bust my back through school on scholarships, working nights while you sat on all of that." I folded my hands in front of me. "Daniel, your father left us with nothing but debt. He was reckless. When he died, dangerous people came looking for repayment. Men you were too young to remember, but I remember their threats. I worked night after night to keep you safe, to keep us afloat." Safe. His laugh was sharp, bitter. "You call leaving your 6-year-old alone night after night safe? I thought you didn't care, Mom. I thought I wasn't enough. And now I find out you weren't just absent. You were hiding behind a fortune while I begged for grants just to go to college." The words sank into me heavy and cold. I wanted to reach for him, but his posture screamed distance. I had to keep myself steady. I wasn't hiding behind money. I was building something so no one could ever take from us again. He shook his head. "You don't get it. I needed a mother, not a business empire. Madison's the one who understands that. She gets it." The name sliced through me. Daniel Madison humiliated me in front of 200 people. She shoved food in my face. That's not love or understanding. His voice rose enough that people turned to look. "She was defending me. She said you never showed up for me, and she's right. She loves me for who I am, not for your empire." I lowered my gaze to the table, tracing the edge of my coffee cup with my finger to keep from breaking. Inside, something twisted painfully. Madison's words had already planted themselves in him, growing roots. He wasn't seeing me anymore. He was seeing the mother Madison had painted, absent, cold, selfish. "I worked myself raw to give you a future," I said quietly. "Every choice I made was to protect you." He leaned back, his expression hard. "Protect me from what?" "From knowing the truth. From feeling like I mattered." There it was, not just anger, betrayal. The very thing I'd feared all those years was staring at me across the table in my son's eyes. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away before I touched him. "Daniel." "No." His voice cracked, then hardened again. "Don't. You had your chance. Madison's right. You've never really been here for me." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. The rain outside streaked the window pane, blurring the city lights into smears. I could feel the space between us stretching wider than it ever had. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "Then you've already made your choice." He didn't answer. He stood, straightened his tie, and walked out into the rain without looking back. I sat in the booth, long after he was gone, the untouched coffee growing cold in front of me. My chest ached with a hollow kind of pain. Madison hadn't just humiliated me at that wedding. She'd taken my son's trust and twisted it into a weapon. And if she had already turned him this far against me, then she was far more dangerous than I had realized. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one I carried home with me that night. The package arrived late in the evening, just as the streetlights flickered on outside my Boston apartment. Marcus never wasted words, only a small note tucked under the twine. "Read carefully. Lock the door." I carried the box to the dining table and untied it with trembling hands. Inside were 3 thick folders, the edges worn from handling. I sat down, pulled the lamp closer, and began to read. The first page hit me like a slap. Madison Collins wasn't Madison Collins at all. She had been born Grace Miller in a small town in Ohio. She had enrolled in college 3 different times, never finishing, always leaving behind unpaid bills and broken relationships. At 22, she filed to change her name, reinventing herself like an actress swapping costumes. Photographs were clipped to the files. Madison at charity galas in Miami, her arm looped around men twice her age, diamond bracelets glittering on her wrists, designer gowns hugging her frame, always smiling for the camera, always standing close enough to look like she belonged, but never long enough to stay. The second folder listed names, men who had once been part of her orbit. Victor Collins, age 40, heir to a restaurant empire, 8 months together and then $30,000 gone from his accounts. David Harrison Jr., 44, a pharmaceutical heir, 10 months with her, and when she disappeared, so did $45,000. Jonathan Reed, 38, a tech entrepreneur, 6 months of bliss before he discovered unauthorized transfers in the tens of thousands. None of them had pressed charges. Shame had silenced them. Marcus's notes were scrawled in the margins: pattern clear, charm, isolation, financial bleed, exit. I rubbed my temples, forcing myself to keep reading. The third folder was thicker, darker. Madison had once worked at a company called Elder Transitions, an organization that claimed to help seniors manage their estates. The FBI had investigated them for targeting wealthy elderly clients, pushing them into signing over assets under the guise of assistance. Several employees had been charged. Madison's name hadn't made the court documents, but there she was listed on staff records for nearly a year. She left just as indictments began. A separate report from a psychologist was stapled at the back. The words swam in the dim light: narcissistic tendencies, manipulative behavior, pathological need for control, uses vulnerability, real or fabricated, as leverage. I sat back in my chair, staring at the papers that painted my daughter-in-law not as the radiant bride who had just married my son, but as a predator with a history, a method, and a future plan. I closed my eyes and saw Daniel's face across that cafe table, repeating Madison's words as if they were gospel. "She's the one who understands me." My stomach knotted. Madison had studied him just as she had studied every man before him. She had discovered his wound, the absence of his mother, and filled it with the image of herself as the one person who truly cared. I flipped to the final section. Marcus had underlined a passage in red ink. Current marriage to Daniel Harper appears to fit previous pattern. Target is emotionally vulnerable due to strained maternal relationship. Asset pool significantly larger than prior victims. Estimated $3.2 billion in holdings. My breath caught. For the first time in years, I felt real fear crawl down my spine. Not fear for myself, but for Daniel. Madison wasn't just cruel. She was calculated. She hadn't married for love. She had married for blood access. Through Daniel, she now had a direct line to everything I had built. I gathered the files back into a pile, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I imagined her smile at the wedding, the gleam in her eye as she pressed that plate into my face. It hadn't been drunken spite. It had been theater. A performance designed to humiliate, to weaken me in my son's eyes, to make herself the savior and me the villain. The storm outside had grown louder, rain tapping against the windows in steady rhythm. I pushed away from the table and paced the room, clutching the edge of the sofa for balance. I had spent decades planning, sacrificing, building a fortress of wealth and secrecy to protect Daniel from the dangers of the world. And now the danger was sitting in his bed, wearing his ring, whispering in his ear. I pressed my palms against my face and whispered into the empty apartment. "What have you done, Daniel? What have you let in?" When I lowered my hands, my eyes landed back on Marcus's note. "Read carefully. Lock the door." He knew this wasn't just information. It was a warning. Madison had already started the script, and I was watching the first act unfold. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, the folders spread open like wounds across my table. I sat down again, my resolve hardening with each second. If Madison thought she could recycle the same con, she hadn't yet realized she had chosen the wrong family. But deep inside, another truth chilled me. She was replaying the same story she had perfected before. And this time the prize wasn't a few $1,000s. This time the prize was Daniel, and $3.2 billion. The knock at my door was too polite, too rehearsed. When I opened it, Daniel stood there with Madison at his side, her hand looped through his arm like a ribbon tied around a prize. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, no trace of the glittering bride from a week ago. Her makeup was soft, her eyes wide and watery, as though she had practiced in a mirror. "Mom," Daniel said, forcing a small smile. "We thought it might be good to talk." I stepped aside, letting them in. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, my quiet refuge invaded by perfume and tension. Madison perched carefully on the edge of the sofa, folding her hands in her lap like a penitent child. Daniel remained standing, his arm protectively behind her shoulders. "Mrs. Harper," Madison began, her voice trembling. "I owe you the deepest apology. What I did at the wedding was unforgivable. I was overwhelmed, emotional, and I lashed out. I humiliated you, and I regret it deeply." Her lower lip quivered, the tissue in her hand dabbing at dry eyes. She leaned forward, reaching for my hand with a theatrical shake in her fingers. "Please believe me. I never meant to hurt you. I love Daniel, and I want us to be a family." I let her fingers rest on mine for a moment. Cold. Too controlled. I said nothing, only watched. Daniel's eyes flicked to mine, hopeful, pleading. "She's been beating herself up all week, Mom. I know it doesn't excuse what happened, but she wants to make things right." The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I studied Madison's face. Beneath the softness, I saw the steel. She wasn't here to apologize. She was here to pivot. "Family," she repeated softly, as if trying the word on her tongue. "And family takes care of each other, which is why Daniel and I have been talking. We worry about you, about all the pressure you carry. It can't be easy managing everything alone. Maybe it's time you had some help. Daniel's wonderful with finances. He could take some of that burden off your shoulders." Her gaze was steady now, less trembling, more direct. Daniel nodded, almost eager. "She's right, Mom. You've done it all alone for so long, but let me step in even a little. You shouldn't have to worry about bills or investments anymore." I tilted my head as if considering. Inside, I felt the air sharpen. There it was, the first thread of the trap being laid. "I've managed fine for years," I said evenly. "Of course you have," Madison replied quickly, voice dripping with admiration. "You're extraordinary. But even the strongest people need support. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. Besides, wouldn't it be nice to spend more time enjoying life instead of dealing with all those numbers?" Her eyes flicked around the room, then casual but searching. They lingered on the shelves, the closed drawers of the credenza. Then, with a hint of curiosity too sharp to be innocent, she asked, "Where do you keep all your important papers?" "Mrs. Harper, I imagine someone like you must have a safe, right?" The question hung in the air. Daniel didn't even flinch. He thought it was harmless small talk. But in that instant, I saw the mask slip. The wide, apologetic eyes hardened just for a breath into calculation. I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "Oh, nothing so grand. Just a few folders here and there." Madison's expression softened again, the mask sliding neatly back into place. She laughed lightly, almost too lightly. Of course. Silly me. Daniel touched my shoulder. Mom, think about it, okay? I just want to help. We both do. I nodded slowly, pretending to weigh his words, though the truth was already set in stone. Madison hadn't come for forgiveness. She had come to scout the terrain to test how close she could get to the vault she thought I lived inside. As they stood to leave, Madison squeezed my hand once more. Thank you for hearing me out. It means so much. Her smile lingered as she walked through my doorway, but the echo of her question remained louder than anything else. Do you have a safe? When the door clicked shut behind them, I leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Whatever doubt I had left dissolved in that moment. Madison wasn't fumbling in the dark. She was hunting, and my son was already tethered in her snare. Marcus's call came early in the morning, his voice clipped and direct. She's moving fast. Madison met with a Dr. Patricia Owens yesterday, a geriatric psychiatrist. And today she's got an appointment scheduled with James Porter, a notary who's been tied to questionable estate transfers before. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee untouched. The sunlight through the blinds cut harsh lines across the folders still stacked there. So she's setting the stage, I said quietly. She is. This isn't impulse, Evelyn. It's structured. Owens has a reputation for producing convenient diagnoses when money is involved. And Porter. Let's just say he's been present at more than one contested will. My hand tightened around the phone. Thank you, Marcus. Keep digging. Don't let her out of your sight. When I hung up, I opened my laptop. I didn't have to search far. My face filled the screen on a dozen platforms, frozen in the moment Madison had slammed potatoes into me. The clip had spread like fire. On TikTok, it had millions of views set to mocking music. On YouTube, commentators with smug voices called me the greedy mom who got what she deserved. The captions were brutal, entitled mother-in-law. Finally, someone put her in her place. And the comments? God, the comments. She looks like she's been leeching off her son for years. No wonder the bride snapped. Rich people pretending to be poor. It's always the same. I closed the laptop hard, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. My face burned as though the potatoes were still there. Humiliation was one thing. Public ridicule worldwide was another. Somewhere across the city, my son was living with the fallout, too. Later that afternoon, Marcus sent me a note about Daniel. At his office in Cambridge, where he worked for a mid-sized tech company, co-workers had cornered him in the break room. Hey Harper, one of them had laughed, did your mom at least get a taste? Looks like mashed potatoes are the new wedding cake. Another chimed in, man, I'd die if my mom went viral like that. Daniel had stormed out, face red, his jaw tight. And where had he gone? Straight into Madison's waiting arms. I didn't need Marcus's photos to picture it. Her arms wrapping around him, her soothing voice telling him he was right to cut me out, right to trust her instead. She was painting herself as the protector, the one person who understood him, while I was cast as the cruel, greedy mother. And she didn't stop there. She was playing her role for the public, too. A lifestyle blog quoted her saying, I only lost my temper because I've watched Daniel suffer for years. He deserves better than the neglect he grew up with. Tears in her eyes, trembling voice, the perfect performance. Every word she spoke chipped away at the ground beneath me, isolating me further, pushing Daniel deeper into her grip. That night, I sat with Marcus's files spread before me, my fingers tracing the photographs of her past victims. Different men, same pattern. Smiles, whispers, money missing. And none of them had stopped her. She had walked away untouched, reinvented, and ready for the next. Not this time. Not with my son. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus again. I want more than surveillance, I told him. This isn't just a con. This is a criminal enterprise, and she's about to make her biggest move. I want federal eyes on this. There was silence on the line. Then Marcus exhaled. I was hoping you'd say that. I know someone who specializes in elder fraud. She doesn't mess around. Agent Lisa Monroe, FBI. The name landed like a stone in my chest. FBI. It meant escalation. It meant exposure. But it also meant protection. Set it up, I said. The next afternoon, Marcus brought her to me. She was in her early 40s, sharp navy suit, hair pulled back, eyes that took in everything at once. No small talk. She placed a recorder on my coffee table and said simply, "Tell me everything." And so I did. I told her about Madison's attack at the wedding, about the viral video, about Daniel's coldness, about Marcus's files. I spoke until my throat went raw, until the humiliation and fear spilled out in words I hadn't planned. Agent Monroe listened without interruption, only nodding occasionally, her pen scratching quick notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This fits a pattern we've seen before," she said. "Exploiting perceived cognitive decline, manipulating power of attorney, siphoning assets. But if we want to stop her, we need proof. Solid, admissible proof. That means letting her think she's winning so we can catch her in the act." I met her gaze. "You're asking me to play along. I'm asking you to bait the trap," she corrected. "And from what I've seen, you're more than capable." I pressed my palms against my knees, steadying myself. Outside, the city was loud. Sirens, horns, rain hitting pavement. But inside, everything narrowed into a sharp, silent focus. Madison thought she had written the script. She thought she could humiliate me, isolate my son, and step into my fortune without resistance. She didn't know I had just handed her story over to someone who could rewrite the ending. Agent Monroe slid her card across the table. "We'll do this carefully, Mrs. Harper. One step at a time. But I promise you we won't let her win." I picked up the card, my hand steady now. For the first time since that wedding, I felt the faintest spark of control return. Madison had declared war in front of 200 witnesses. She just didn't realize I was ready to fight back, with the law on my side. I started small. A set of keys left on the counter, then forgotten when I left for the grocery store. I came back 20 minutes later and pretended to panic, patting my pockets and shaking my head until Daniel sighed quietly, worried while Madison smirked behind him. The next week, I stood in the checkout line with 2 identical bags of flour. "How did that happen?" I murmured, making sure Madison could hear. She exchanged a triumphant glance with Daniel, like my confusion was a prize she had been waiting to collect. I even let myself stumble over dates in conversation. When Daniel asked if I remembered his birthday dinner next month, I smiled blankly and said, "Didn't we already celebrate that in April?" His face fell, and Madison placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sweetheart, I think your mom needs to be evaluated. Just to be safe." Her suggestion didn't sound like a suggestion at all. It was the push she'd been aiming for, and Daniel, already anxious, nodded reluctantly. 2 days later, he drove me to a brick building in Cambridge where Dr. Patricia Owens had her office. The walls were a dull beige, the waiting room lined with magazines no one touched. Madison came along, of course, sitting too close to Daniel, whispering encouragement while casting me pitying glances. "Dr. Owens greeted me with a practiced smile, her hand cool and dry. "Mrs. Harper. I understand you've been experiencing some difficulties. Nothing to be afraid of. We'll just run a few tests." Her office was staged for comfort, muted paintings, plush chairs, a soft rug, but everything about her felt scripted. She guided me to a table and laid out the first test. Simple memory cards with shapes and colors. I deliberately hesitated, choosing the wrong pairs. Her pen scratched across her clipboard. "Now repeat this list of words back to me," she said. I fumbled them intentionally, pausing, repeating the wrong sequence. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Madison's satisfied smile. Daniel leaned forward, worry etching his forehead. Math problems followed. Subtraction, division, nothing complicated. I stumbled through them, sighing with frustration, rubbing my temples as if the effort drained me. "Dr." Owens nodded sympathetically, jotting notes. Do you ever feel overwhelmed managing daily tasks? She asked in a careful tone. All the time, I said, letting my shoulders slump. Numbers, bills. It all blurs together. Sometimes I forget what I've already done. She glanced toward Madison and Daniel, and in that quick flicker of her eyes, I saw everything I needed. This wasn't impartial medical assessment. It was a performance as staged as Madison's crocodile tears. When the tests ended, Dr. Owens folded her hands and smiled reassuringly. You did very well, Mrs. Harper. Of course there are some concerns about your short-term memory and problem-solving. I'll prepare a report. It may be helpful for your family to assist with financial decisions going forward just to ease your burden. Daniel nodded quickly. Madison's nails tapped lightly against his sleeve in rhythm as if she was silently applauding her own success. I gave Dr. Owens a weary smile. Thank you, Doctor. I suppose that would be wise. As we left the office, Madison's voice was sweet, almost giddy. See, it wasn't so bad. Now we'll all have peace of mind. Daniel drove us back in silence, his hand tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. He was already picturing a future where he'd have to carry the responsibility for me, where Madison could slide easily into the role of caretaker. I stared out the passenger window at the gray sky rain beginning to spatter the glass. Inside, though, I was coldly certain. I had given Dr. Owens exactly what she wanted to see. She would put it on paper, deliver it neatly to Madison, and that report would be their ticket to begin dismantling my control. They thought they were winning. But what I saw that afternoon confirmed the truth. Madison had bought herself a doctor, and the trap she was so eager to set was about to snap shut. Not on me, but on her. The smell of pot roast filled the apartment, heavy with too much salt and pepper. I had ruined it on purpose, letting the gravy turn briny, the carrots too soft, the potatoes overcooked. The kitchen counters were cluttered with spice jars, left open a display of carelessness that wasn't carelessness at all. Marcus had been there earlier, moving through the apartment quietly like a shadow. He had placed cameras behind the framed photos on the shelves, microphones tucked into the seams of the dining chairs. By the time he left, the apartment looked unchanged, but every corner now listened. At 7 sharp, the knock came. Daniel stood with his arm around Madison, who looked immaculate as ever. Hair, sleek dress fitted her smile, polite but cautious. She leaned in and kissed my cheek with staged warmth. Thank you for having us. Mrs. Harper? It's good to sit down together like this. I forced a wavering smile. Family dinners are important, aren't they? It's been too long. We sat at the table. Daniel filled his plate quickly, more out of habit than hunger, while Madison waited, hands folded, eyes darting across the dishes. When she finally tasted the roast, she hid her grimace behind a sip of wine. Daniel, ever loyal, said, "It's delicious, Mom." His voice was strained, the salt burning his tongue. I let out a weary sigh, putting down my fork. I've been thinking a lot lately, I said, letting the silence stretch. I'm tired. Managing everything. It's becoming too much. Maybe it's time I thought about transferring some of my assets. The fork slipped from Madison's hand with a small clatter. Her eyes lit up so quickly I thought she might give herself away. That's very wise, she said carefully. Daniel and I only want what's best for you. I actually know an attorney who specializes in this kind of transition. The paperwork could be quick, simple. Daniel nodded eagerly, though his brow furrowed with worry. You don't have to do this if you're not ready, Mom. I am ready, I murmured, looking down at my plate. Then I raised my eyes, fixing them on Madison. But my lawyer insists on one condition. Everything we discuss about a transfer has to be recorded, video and audio, so there's no question later that it was my choice. For the first time all evening, Madison's mask cracked. Her smile faltered, her fingers tightening around her wineglass. Recorded? That doesn't seem necessary, Mrs. Harper. Family should trust one another. Daniel turned to her. It's not a bad idea. If it makes her comfortable, why not? This is a huge decision. Having it on record protects everyone. Madison opened her mouth, then closed it again. She forced a laugh too light, too sharp. Of course, if that's what makes you feel secure, I understand. The tension broke like a snapped string. I leaned back in my chair, feigning relief. Good. That settles it. For the rest of the meal, Madison tried to steer the conversation toward logistics. Lawyers trust structures accounts. Her voice grew animated, her hands gesturing as if she were already in control of it all. Daniel listened, his features a blend of excitement and unease, the weight of responsibility settling on him. I pushed food around my plate, nodding occasionally, all the while watching Madison's eyes. Every so often, her gaze flicked toward my desk in the corner, toward the credenza where she imagined papers and contracts might be stored. Hunger lived there, barely disguised. When dessert came, a pie burned just slightly around the edges. She declined with a soft smile. We should let your mother rest, Daniel. She's been through so much already. As they stood, she touched my shoulder, her voice syrup-sweet. You won't regret this, Mrs. Harper. You're making a very smart choice. I patted her hand, smiling faintly. I hope so, dear. The door closed behind them, leaving the apartment in silence once more. I stood for a long moment in the quiet, then walked back to the dining table. Marcus's voice came through the small receiver hidden under the lamp. We got it. Clear audio and video. She agreed on record. I exhaled, steadying my hands against the back of the chair. Oh, Madison thought she'd maneuvered me into surrender. She had no idea she'd just stepped straight into my trap. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and ink, the kind of scent that clings when papers are spread out across polished wood. I sat at the head of my dining table, hands folded in my lap, the picture of frailty. Across from me, Daniel shifted uneasily in his chair, his eyes moving from me to the neat stacks of documents. Madison sat close at his side, her posture straight, her lips pulled into a calm smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dr. Patricia Owens sat further down the table, her legs crossed neatly, a folder balanced on her knee. Next to her, James Porter, the notary, adjusted his tie and uncapped a pen, his voice droning as he skimmed over the documents. 60% of Mrs. Harper's liquid assets will be transferred into a joint trust. Daniel Harper named primary beneficiary, Madison Collins Harper co-trustee with full signing authority. He barely looked up from the pages, his explanation rushed, glossing over the language that would hand Madison everything she wanted. I let my hand tremble slightly as I reached for the pen. The silence grew taut. Daniel's brow furrowed. Mom, are you sure about this? His voice cracked with concern. I lifted the pen slowly, then paused. My eyes drifted to Madison, who leaned forward with expectant hunger. I let my voice come out frail, wavering. And what about the men before Madison? The ones you left behind? The color drained from Daniel's face. What men, he demanded, turning to her. What is she talking about? Madison's smile froze, then returned in a quick flash. She doesn't know what she's saying. It's the confusion, Daniel. Remember the doctor's report? She's mixing things up. I held Daniel's gaze, letting the silence answer for me. His hand tightened on the edge of the table. Is that true, Madison? Her composure faltered. She reached suddenly for the stack of documents, her fingers brushing the top page as if she could snatch them away before the words could sink in. Before she could touch them, the sound of the front door opening split the air. Heavy footsteps echoed into the room. Agent Lisa Monroe entered, flanked by 2 other FBI agents, their badges flashing their presence, filling the apartment with authority. Madison Collins. Harper. Dr. Patricia Owens. James Porter. Agent Monroe said firmly, "We have warrants for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, elder financial exploitation, and attempted theft of assets exceeding $3 billion. The room erupted in chaos. Madison shot to her feet, her face drained of color, hands raised as the agents moved toward her. "This is insane, Daniel, tell them. Tell them your mother's delusional." Daniel sat frozen, shock, pinning him to his chair. He stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Owens tried to protest, her voice breaking. "I was only performing an evaluation." "An evaluation you falsified." Agent Monroe cut her off, producing a folder from her briefcase. "We have evidence of payments you received directly from Madison Collins Harper, bank transfers, communication logs, and testimony from previous victims." James Porter slumped in his chair, sweat beading at his temple as the cuffs snapped around his wrists. "I just notarized what they asked," he muttered, eyes darting to the floor. Madison's mask cracked completely now, her voice sharp with fury. "Daniel, they're lying. She's been plotting this. Your mother set me up." The agents pulled her arms behind her, the click of metal loud in the still air. She twisted her eyes, burning into me. "You'll regret this, Evelyn." I met her gaze without blinking. "No, Madison. You will—" Daniel's breathing quickened. He looked from Madison to me, his face pale and stricken. The betrayal etched itself into his features each second, stripping away the illusions she had built around him. As the agents guided Madison, Owens, and Porter toward the door, the room fell quiet, except for the sound of cuffs rattling and papers rustling. Daniel pressed his hand against his forehead, shaking his head as though trying to wake from a dream. I reached for his hand across the table, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty doorway where Madison had disappeared, the truth settling heavy and unyielding on his shoulders. In that silence, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Daniel collapsed into the chair, his shoulders hunched. His hands, gripping his knees so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He stared at the space where Madison had been, where the agents had dragged her out in cuffs, and his lips parted like he wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet, bloodshot. "You've been lying to me my entire life," he said hoarsely. "Everything. Who you are, what we had, what we didn't. You let me grow up thinking we had nothing." The words pierced deeper than any insult. I forced myself to meet his gaze. "I didn't lie about the struggle, Daniel. Your father left us with debts, not savings. He was reckless. He owed money to people who didn't ask politely. I worked every hour I could to keep them off our backs, to keep them from coming after you. That's why I missed your games, your plays. I wasn't choosing money over you. I was choosing survival for us both." Daniel shook his head, his voice breaking. "All those years I thought you just didn't care. I cared too much," I whispered. "I cared enough to break myself to build something safe. Harper Holdings wasn't born out of greed. It was born out of desperation, brick by brick, so that no one could ever threaten us again." The room was silent until Agent Monroe returned from the hallway, a thick folder in her hands. She set it on the table between us and flipped it open. Photographs slid into the light, Madison in glittering dresses on the arms of men I had never met, notes in Marcus's handwriting beside them. Dates, bank transfers, unexplained withdrawals. Daniel's trembling hand reached out. He picked up the first photo, stared at it, as if the woman smiling back couldn't possibly be the one he had married. He turned page after page, his breath shallow, the color draining from his face. This can't be real," he murmured. Agent Monroe's voice was steady. "It's real. We've confirmed everything with the victims. Each of them thought they were in love. Each of them lost tens of thousands before she vanished. The pattern is clear." Daniel's hand shook so badly he dropped one of the pages. He bent to retrieve it, but froze when his eyes caught on the next document in the folder. It wasn't a photograph this time. It was a medical report. He picked it up slowly, scanning the words. His face twisted, and for a moment I thought he might be sick. She told me." His voice cracked almost a sob. "She told me she was pregnant." Agent Monroe folded her arms. "That test result was purchased online. We verified with her medical records. There's no pregnancy. It was staged just like everything else. Daniel's fingers crumpled the edge of the page as if he wanted to tear it apart. He pressed it flat against the table, then bent forward until his forehead rested on top of it. His shoulders shook, his breaths ragged. I reached across the table and laid my hand gently on his arm. For the first time since he was a child, he didn't pull away. He whispered into the papers, his voice muffled and raw. Everything she told me was a lie. I stroked his sleeve, my own chest heavy with grief for him. Yes, I said softly, but now you know the truth. And the truth is the only thing that can set you free from her. Daniel stayed bent over the folder, his body trembling, the dam of betrayal finally breaking. The sound of his quiet sobs filled the room, and I sat beside him, my hand on his arm, knowing that whatever else came next, my son's world had just shattered completely. Daniel moved into a small apartment just a few blocks from mine in Boston. For the first week, he barely spoke. He answered questions with nods, spent hours staring out the window, his coffee cooling untouched on the table. I didn't press him. Some wounds needed silence before they could begin to heal. One gray morning, I asked him to come with me. "There's something I want you to see," I said, keeping my tone light. He didn't ask where, just followed me into the car, his hands stuffed in his pockets. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor of Harper Holdings, the city skyline stretched out in all directions. The air inside hummed with quiet efficiency, phones ringing, printers churning, the murmur of voices moving deals forward. My assistant Claire greeted us warmly. "Mr. Harper, it's wonderful to finally meet you. Your mother talks about you all the time." Daniel froze, his eyes flicking to me. Surprise, then confusion crossed his face. "She does?" "Of course," Claire said, smiling. "She keeps a picture of you from college on her desk." He didn't answer. His jaw tightened as though the words had struck a nerve. I led him through the halls, introducing him to the leadership team. Each handshake came with a story. "Your mother showed us your essay from high school," one executive told him. "Brilliant piece on renewable energy," another said. "She always reminds us you were the reason she built all this." Daniel forced polite smiles, but his silence deepened. Later, when the door closed behind us in my office, he spoke, his voice low. "It's strange. Everyone here seems to know more about you than I do. More about me, even." The truth in his words stung. I swallowed hard. "You're right," I admitted. "I've shared parts of myself with them that I should have shared with you first." He turned toward the window, hands in his pockets, his reflection caught against the city below. All those years I thought I didn't matter. Meanwhile, strangers knew I was the reason behind it all. "Do you know what that feels like?" I couldn't answer. Silence hung heavy between us. To break it, I led him on. "Come, there's more." We passed through conference rooms lined with maps and charts. Screens displayed real-time updates of construction projects, acquisitions, market forecasts. Daniel paused at a wall-sized chart showing charitable initiatives, scholarships, housing grants, community clinics. "These are ours?" he asked, almost whispering. "Yes, every dollar tied to a promise I once made to you." We stopped finally in the main atrium where the company's logo, Harper Holdings, spanned the marble wall gleaming under the lights. Daniel stood there for a long time, his hands falling loose at his sides. "This is bigger than I ever imagined," he said, his voice unsteady. His eyes flicked up to the letters, then back to me. "And you carried it alone all these years." I watched him, the mixture of awe and pain etched across his face. For the first time I saw recognition, not just of what I had built, but of the cost. He touched the edge of the wall, his fingers tracing the cold metal of the logo. "I don't know whether to be proud or angry," he admitted. I stepped closer, but not too close. "You don't have to choose, Daniel. Both can be true." His eyes shimmered as he looked back at the name. Our name. Etched larger than life. And in that moment I knew he was seeing not just a company but the weight of a lifetime he had never been allowed to share. The courthouse in downtown Boston buzzed with reporters' cameras flashing as I stepped through the metal detectors. The air was heavy, like everyone already knew today would mark the end of something. Daniel walked beside me, his jaw tight, his hands clenched in fists. For weeks he had barely spoken, still sifting through the wreckage of his marriage, but today he was steady, almost protective. When we entered the courtroom, Madison was already seated at the defense table, her hair pulled back in a plain bun, her expensive clothes replaced with an ill-fitting suit. She looked smaller, stripped of the glamour she had once worn like armor. Dr. Owens sat rigidly next to her face, pale, while James Porter wiped his forehead with a shaking handkerchief. The prosecutor laid out the case clearly: fraud conspiracy, elder exploitation. Exhibits flashed on the screen, bank transfers recordings, Marcus's surveillance footage. My own voice played from the night of the dinner, and then Madison's smooth and greedy urging Daniel to help her secure my assets. The jury barely looked at her. Their faces hardened with each piece of evidence. When Madison's attorney tried to argue she had been manipulated, the judge cut him off. "The pattern is clear," he said firmly. "This court has seen enough." The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. All counts. Madison's sentence, 8 years in federal prison followed by probation. Owens and Porter received their own terms, lighter but still binding them to shame. As the gavel struck, the room erupted in whispers. Madison twisted in her seat, her eyes finding mine across the space. For a moment I saw the fury return, but it was powerless now, swallowed by handcuffs and the certainty of bars. Outside, the headlines spread faster than the trial had begun. Boston billionaire's daughter-in-law, sentenced for fraud. From viral shame to vindication, Evelyn Harper's story. The same public that had mocked me with mashed potato memes now called me the mother who had been misunderstood, who had survived humiliation and turned it into justice. I didn't care for their sympathy. What mattered sat next to me on the courthouse steps. Daniel lowered himself beside me, shoulders heavy, but his hand reached out tentative to rest on mine. For a long time he said nothing, just stared at the ground as if the words were too heavy to lift. Then softly he whispered, "Mom." The word carried more weight than any verdict. It cracked something open in both of us. I turned to him, my throat tight. "I'm here, Daniel. I always have been, even when I didn't show it the way you needed." His eyes glistened. "I know. I think I'm starting to understand." The weeks that followed were quiet, restorative in their own way. Daniel moved into an office at Harper Holdings, not high above with the executives, but in a modest corner where he could learn. I introduced him to the teams, let him sit in on meetings, watch how decisions rippled into lives beyond the glass walls. At first he lingered on the edges, uncertain, but slowly he leaned in, asking questions, contributing ideas. One afternoon we toured a construction site together, part of a project for affordable housing. As we stood before the rising steel beams, a worker shouted to me, "Mrs. Harper will meet the deadline." Daniel watched the exchange, his expression shifting from distance to recognition. "This is real," he said quietly. "What you built, it actually changes lives." "Yes," I answered, "and now it's ours to carry forward." That night back in my apartment, I sat with the photo album of his childhood again. Daniel walked in, saw me with it, and instead of turning away as he once had, he sat beside me. Together we turned the pages. His small hand in mine from years ago, his smile in faded school portraits, the reminders of all I had missed and all I had tried to protect. For the first time, he didn't look at those gaps with anger, but with the beginning of forgiveness. The road ahead would not be smooth. Scars don't fade easily. But we were walking it side by side no longer, as strangers bound only by blood, but as a mother and son who had survived betrayal, humiliation, and truth, and chosen each other again. Sometimes I think back to that wedding night, to the heat of potatoes burning my cheek, to the laughter and the silence that followed. I thought it was the end of everything, but it was only the beginning. Sometimes cruelty cracks open the ground beneath us, just enough for truth to rise. Justice doesn't need to shout, it waits patient for its moment. And love, even bruised, even betrayed, can outlast the darkest storms. If you've ever faced betrayal in your own family, would you stay silent or stand up? Share your story. Someone else may need to hear it.